Back to Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the second hour of the show. This hour of Just Energy Radio is brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics, where you too can learn to become a medical intuitive, energy medicine practitioner, or intuitive counselor. For more information, go to www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. And don't forget, Just Energy Radio can be heard live on the Inception Radio Network. That's www.inceptionradionetwork.com. But to keep informed of all of our upcoming wonderful guests, please go to Just Energy Radio. That's justenergyradio.com, and sign up for our weekly newsletter where you'll get an email to let you know who's coming up. And we usually schedule out pretty far in advance so you can plan your schedule. And actually, one of the things that I want to remind you, next week, other than being Thanksgiving, we are going to be having our traditional Thanksgiving show where it would be myself and Wayne LaLiberty coming on air. We are opening up the phone lines and taking your calls. Our topic this year is Conspiracy to Uncover Our Past. Is our true history hiding in plain sight? So please call in if you want to talk about things like ancient mysteries, UFO, conspiracy theories, and much more. I also will be doing on-air psychic readings. Ooh, don't pass out. On-air psychic readings. So call in and join the fun. That's next Friday, the 23rd. Anyway, let me tell you about this hour's guest. It's a good friend of mine, Lyle Blackburn, and we're going to be talking about beasts, monsters, and Bigfoot. Lyle Blackburn is a frequent contributor and cryptozoology advisor to Rue Morgue magazine, one of the leading horror media publications in print today. Lyall's Monstro Bizarro blog is featured on Rue Morgue's website, and his Monstro Bizarro Presents news column appears monthly in the print magazine. Lyall's new book, The Beast of Boggy Creek, published by Anomalous Books, delves into one of the classic cases of cryptozoology, that of the Faulk Monster. So from LyallBlackburn.com, the author of The Beast of Boggy Creek, Lyle Blackburn. Hey, Lyle, how's it going?
Hey, it's going good.
It was, for those that don't know, Lyall and I got to hang out at the History, Haunts, and Legends Conference in spooky Jefferson, Texas a couple of weeks ago. And it's not the first time that Lyall and I have met, but it was fun just being in your aura there, Lyall.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, it was good times. And this time we got to hang out in Texas, so yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, because we're neighbors.
Yeah, we are. I mean, which is funny because the first time we met was in Sacramento, California, so, you know, it's kind of
all the good people. I'm learning all the good people live in Texas. Who'd have thunk?
Well, apparently so.
So let's start here. You're new to the show, and one of the things I always like to ask is, you know, a little bit of history. So let's start with, how did you become interested in cryptozoology in the first place?
Well, long before I ever had heard the term cryptozoology, I was just interested in things like Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, at a very early age. I mean, I was always kind of attracted to horror movies and monsters and all that. And I was particularly fascinated with things like the Bermuda Triangle and Bigfoot and ghosts, you know, things that were allegedly real. And those kind of grabbed me a little more than the horror movies. Not that I didn't find those fascinating and I'm a horror movie lover, but those things kind of scared me when I was a kid because, you know, to see the Patterson film and to think, wow, that thing could be real. You know, it just really grabbed me from an early age. So, you it wasn't until years later, till I started doing some writing, that I kind of just gravitated towards the cryptozoology stuff. I had started doing some Bigfoot research and hanging out with people who were into that, so that kind of really rekindled all that for me as an adult. And I'd grown up in Texas hunting with my father, so I was, familiar with the backwoods of Texas, Arkansas, and those places. So I just kind of combined that with my love for the unexplained and Bigfoot, and sort of put myself out there in the field and started doing a lot of research, and that just one thing led to another, and led to me writing the book.
And now you're here on Just Energy Radio. Woohoo!
Yes, and led to radio interviews, and so yeah, it's been a fun ride.
So you mentioned the Patterson film, and I'm assuming that is the video with the hairy creature that is walking forward and then does that kind of 3/4 turn and looks at the camera and then turns and continues walking away?
Right. The Patterson Gimlin film, which was filmed in 1967. So, yeah, that's kind of the famous thing. And, back when I was a kid, those were one of the things running on the TV in the 70s, as well as movies like The Legend of Boggy Creek. So those all kind of played into the imagery one would have at an early age back then for Bigfoot.
But since you mentioned it, and I remember seeing that footage, on TV, it was kind of up there with images of the Nazca lines and some other images, pictures of the pyramids. But when I saw that, I was like, whoa. I thought it was real. What do you think? I mean, what did you think back then? And what do you think now that you've done a lot more research into the whole area of Bigfoot?
Well, I always try to think back, when I saw that as a kid, what was I really thinking? I remember thinking, it was real. And that was kind of my initial reaction, and it was on TV, so it must be real. I didn't have the scientific approach as I do now, but at this point, I've even interviewed Bob Gimlin, the other half of the duo that was there and allegedly filmed the creature back in the 60s. And, I've really done a lot of research and listened to all the stories and read the books. And, I'm still partial to think that it could be real. There's just really no way to tell. It's just one of those things that people keep debating and looking at the film, but there's only so much data there in that grainy old film. There's nothing else you can extract from it. There's no proof positive, so it's pretty much always going to be up for debate, I suppose, unless somebody comes up with any corroborating film evidence or a suit or anything else. I mean, it's just people's words against the other. And so, I'm kind of hopeful that it is real, and I do believe there's a very good possibility that Bigfoot, on the whole, is real. So, I'm putting a good probability on the whole thing being real.
Cool. We'll just put out good energy and vibe on that. In your book, Beast of Boggy Creek, you talk about the Faulk Monster. Am I saying that right? The Faulk Monster?
Pretty close. Faulk.
Faulk.
Like as if it had a W in it. So it's having the Faulk Monster as the subject of my book. It's always tough because it's a hard word to pronounce. So, and I've heard a lot
and I can't
worse
pronounce anything, so I thought I was pretty close. Anyway, what, in the very general sense of the word, because obviously we're going to go deeper into this, what is a Faulk? I mean, my first knee-jerk reaction to that is, well, what is a Faulk Monster? Or is that not the right interpretation of that?
Well, there in the mythology and legends of Bigfoot, there is a lot of regional legends and names for creatures that are essentially Sasquatch. And depending on the newspapers and the reports and how far they go back, they've given them localized names to identify these creatures. So the Fouke Monster just happens to be a Sasquatch-like creature in southwest Arkansas, and that's the name it received because it was seen near this little town called Fouke. But in essence, it's a Sasquatch, a southern Sasquatch. You would have other. If you go into Texas, there's the Caddo Critter and other, the Chambers Creek Monster and things like this. So it's just another name for Bigfoot.
Okay, but it's a contemporary name. It's not one that comes to us from history kind of thing.
Right. It was given the name in the 1970s. I mean, there's a longer history of sightings of the creature, but, the one that kind of stuck as calling it the Fouke Monster, and that's what it was referred to in the newspapers. That all came about in the 1970s. So it was a name that was given, in contemporary times.
There are a lot of Native American groups that report hairy ape men or Sasquatches. When you look at that geographic area, that region, do you find that there are, indigenous stories that talk about big hairy ape men, Bigfoot creatures as well?
Yes, certainly. There was several tribes that lived in the Arkansas area. One of those would be the Caddo Indians. And, they, like most of the other tribes, had a specific word for a hairy man or a giant or a, man of the woods, this type of thing. And, you kind of have to assume these things, but that they do seem to be talking about a creature that they believed was real flesh and blood, and therefore gave it a name to identify it. And, these would be sort of the supporting evidence of history that says, there were creatures like this living in the area. It's not just a modern phenomenon. It goes back further than that. So certainly the Arkansas tribes, did apparently see these creatures.
The part that I found very interesting about this story was the notion that most people have is that Bigfoot, and I'll just say Bigfoot, is isolated to the Pacific Northwest. And I was thinking, wait a minute, you're talking about, Texarkana. You mentioned Marshall, Texas, which, I drove through, and Karnak. I just drove through that the other day. I mean, these are places that I've gone to and been to, and you're talking about there's a Bigfoot just down the street.
Yeah, and that's the thing, people are starting to become more aware of, especially with the internet and shows like Finding Bigfoot, where they go to different states every episode and do investigations. And we do see that there's Bigfoot reports coming from all over the U.S. And it's interesting because if you look at the regional newspapers and things like that, you will see there's a history of these type things. But in the general pop culture, those weren't the they didn't make their way to the mass public. It was really just a lot of those early California sightings, and the fact that the Patterson-Gimlin film was filmed in Northern California, and there was a lot of sightings from British Columbia. So that the Pacific Northwest was what they originally kind of concentrated on as the home of Bigfoot, and that's kind of what people generally have in their minds when they think of Bigfoot. But as someone like myself gets further into the research, you can find sightings just about everywhere. And had I known as a kid that there was Bigfoot sightings in Texas, that would have been amazing, because my father's family is from a little town called Carthage, which is about 30 miles from Marshall, Texas, out there. So, I went out there all the time, but I had no idea that there was Bigfoot sightings in that area. Now, of course, once I saw the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek, I realized, wow, there's something like that up in Arkansas. But that was about, as a kid, that was about the closest I knew of any kind of creature like that.
They could have been watching you from the woods. Ooh, that's
Possibly
spooky too. So Jefferson not only has ghosts, it potentially has Bigfoot too. And that's just all kinds of stuff packed into one little teeny area.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Jefferson has a great history of sightings. Caddo Lake is located out there, and I sort of tie this all together in my book as sort of the general vicinity where a creature such as a Fouke Monster could possibly live, because Fouke and Boggy Creek and all that is only about an hour and a half from Jefferson, just across the state line into Arkansas. So essentially that whole area is tied together in the history of this creature. And so it is interesting that you have that many sightings in that area.
And that area, I mean, it's pretty, I don't want to say hilly, but there's a lot of trees and foliage. Is that something that you find common with where they have Bigfoot sightings? I mean, obviously the Pacific Northwest is heavily wooded, and foresty areas. Do you find the same thing here, where the sightings tend to be in areas that are more densely covered with trees and stuff?
Yeah, certainly. Whether it's coincidental or whether it's, corroborating the evidence, it is true that the most Bigfoot sightings occur in the areas of high forest regions, also in areas where there's a high percentage of annual rainfall. And, of course, that kind of ties hand in hand with the amount of foliage and stuff in the area. But just kind of if you just kind of look at Texas and look at the history of sightings across Texas, most people think of Texas as being kind of dry and open and all that, but in fact, East Texas is very heavily wooded. So if you look at the history of Bigfoot sightings in Texas, you see that is where the highest concentration of sightings are. And, you've got a few random sightings that get out in central Texas, and then, a couple out in West Texas, where it just seems unlikely that a creature like that could even exist or stay hidden. And, what you see supports that.
I can't even imagine in West Texas. There's just a whole lot of nothing and a couple of tumbleweeds and a cow.
Yeah.
And that's it.
I tend to think that those could have been, mistaken identity or something else. I mean, sure, you could travel the creeks of the state and stay hidden fairly well, but it would be such a challenge. And, to be sighted, a big creature like that to be sighted in West Texas seems just kind of crazy. So, but there's only there's only a few of those kind of sightings. The majority of them are in East Texas, where it's heavily wooded. So it all seems to make sense.
A little earlier, we talked about the Native American report, but then, obviously the white people, the Europeans, came to America and started habitating that territory. And so after we were there, when did people start reporting sightings, or how far back can you go in more American history as far as finding some documentation of sightings of the Faulk Monster? Faulk.
The first sightings in the area that were documented go back to the mid-1800s. So at that point, you start seeing things appear in the local newspapers that reported sightings of what they termed as the wild man, or a wild man, or a hairy man, or something like that. They didn't use the word Bigfoot or Sasquatch, which, those terms didn't come around until the 1950s. So, they were, again, kind of like the Native American sightings. You kind of had to assume that they may have been talking about what we would call a Sasquatch, even though they were calling it a wild man. But if you read the reports, it certainly describes a tall, hairy creature of some sort. So, again, in my book, I kind of lay out the history of the area and look to see what the past sightings were. And, there was the Native Americans, and then in the 1800s, there were the reports in the newspaper. So, again, it kind of supports the theory that there was something living there.
Well, I mean, there are so many people that dismiss oral tradition, but, if it's in the newspaper or on TV, well, then maybe there's something to it. And that's why I was curious how far back they actually go. In that region, I think, the mid to late 1800s, we're already talking like post-Civil War. Was that region very heavily populated at that point in time?
It was starting to get populated. It was really about the time that the steamboat started moving up and down the Red River in the 1830s. You started having people move into the area, and then the railroads kind of came in towards the end of the 1800s, and really put an influx of people into the area. So if you kind of look at the number of sightings you can find that go further back, it just seems like the more people that came into the area, the more sightings of it there were. Although I'm sure, there could have been a lot of sightings that nobody ever reported. I mean, you didn't run to the newspaper, or there was no internet, so it's hard to say how many. But in general, it seems like as the people started moving into the area in the mid-1800s and really, settling into these, wooded areas up there, that there was some, apparent Bigfoot sightings.
I have kind of a weird question, and this is just for my own personal edification, but are the sightings traditionally at night, or do they vary throughout the time of the day?
They vary. I mean, I want to say there was, quite a few at night, but in general, it's all across the board. Late dusk, early morning, sometimes in midday. I mean, which doesn't help the case because, the creature is either nocturnal or diurnal or one or the other. They don't tend to just roam around at all hours, but, they could. The sightings are just kind of all over the map.
Okay, just was curious. One of the things that you've talked about several times is the legend of Boggy Creek. And I know that they made a movie about the legend of Boggy Creek that I remember watching as a kid, but, if you asked me what the details of it are now, I probably couldn't tell you. But was there an incident that incited this interest in the creature and thus getting them to want to make a movie about it? Basically the general story goes like this. In 1971, a family moved to the little town of Fouke, and they were experiencing some strange things going on at night, and they believed that some kind of a large creature was coming up on the porch and trying to get in the window, and eventually like a hairy hand came through the window one night while the guys were out at work and the women were at home. And that sort of culminated into a Saturday night in which the guys just decided to confront this creature, and they took a shotgun and commenced a shooting out there and ran it off into the woods. And in the process of that, one young man, Bobby Ford, decided he'd had enough. They were out there looking with a flashlight, trying to find out if they'd hit it or not, looking for blood, and he was just freaked out and said, "This is enough." So he started heading back up to the house, and as he was going up the steps to the porch, he was attacked by some kind of a hairy creature and tangled with it and ended up almost jumping through the front door. And they described this creature as about 7 feet tall, upright, hairy, man-like creature. He ended up in the hospital down there in Texarkana to be treated for shock and injuries, and that's how it kind of leaked to the press. The doctor down there
called one of the guys down at the radio station and said, "Hey man, I got a guy down here says he was attacked by a hairy monster down in Fouke. You guys ought to go check it out tomorrow." And that's what the press did, and the sheriff was there and the whole thing, and that ended up getting printed in the Texarkana Gazette. And then several weeks later, another local family had a sighting of a creature that ran across Highway 71 near Boggy Creek, and they described it as sort of a monkey-like creature, dark with hair, and so these reports started getting printed in the Texarkana Gazette really every other day. It was just crazy, and that's what attracted a filmmaker by the name of Charles B. Pierce, who was living in Texarkana at the time. And he thought he was looking kind of for the subject for a documentary or a film. This was his first one, and he thought, wow, this is great. It's just right down the road, and so he put together a budget and borrowed some money, got a camera, and went down to Fouke and just started shooting reenactments of these sightings and encounters the people had with the Faulk Monster. And that ended up becoming the movie, The Legend of Boggy Creek, which was released in 1972. And the movie went on to be a huge success in the drive-in and theater circuit back then. I mean, he made it for about $160,000, and it went on to make $25 million. So it was a huge feat for a first-time filmmaker, a guy from Arkansas, and a guy making a Bigfoot movie to actually accomplish something like this. So what that did was make the Faulk Monster internationally famous. Again, you have a lot of these little local regional Bigfoot-type creatures, but in the case of the Faulk Monster, it had a movie vehicle to propel it into another level of fame. And that's why The Legend of Boggy Creek is very influential and beloved among Bigfoot researchers, because a lot of them saw it back in the 70s, or have seen it since, and it's sort of a highlight of the Bigfoot phenomenon. So that's really kind of how it all played out and got into the papers. And of course, once it started getting in the papers, some of the old timers came around and said, "Hey, this isn't the first time there's been sightings of this creature. Don't y'all remember about 10 years ago down in an area called Jonesville, there had been a rash of sightings." So people started coming forward with more stories, and people began to realize that, wow, this is, there's something to this. So, it was, kind of a overwhelming phenomenon.
And it sounds like, from listening to you and reading the book, that the movie, was actually pretty well fact-based. That, I mean, obviously there has to be a certain amount of creative license taken, but that they try to keep true to the stories and the evidence at hand, and not, make it be this thing of total science fiction.
Right. And that's one reason why it was really frightening to people, because it really blurred the lines between what was real and what may have been dramatized. And, a lot of people have the impression, oh, yeah, there was a couple of sightings back in the 70s, and then they made this movie. But doing the research and literally going scene by scene in that movie and tracing back to the original source, I found that pretty much everything in there was based upon a report given by an actual person. These weren't made up. They were, of course, dramatized to make it an entertaining movie. But at the core, it was all based on real reports, and that was amazing. And people don't really realize that that these had actually happened. And of course, people also believe, oh, that all happened back in the 70s. But what I discovered again in my research is there's been sightings ever since. And in fact, some of those sightings are more amazing than the ones that were in the movie. So, this is something that's still going on. It's a current phenomenon.
Total. Do you have, and you can just ballpark it out there, I'm good with that. About how many sightings do you think there have been for this creature in that region?
In the book, I include an appendix which I included details of sightings within 50 miles. figuring that, any animal has a wide range they travel while searching for food and living. So just within 50 miles, I could find over 75 eyewitness reports of it. So, and I'm sure there was many more that never made the paper. And in fact, as I spoke to Fouke locals, people would tell me about this or that and say, well, this person was not going to come forward, So I knew there had been other sightings. So, I'm estimating at least 100 in that area.
And that's a lot for such a small geographic area.
Yeah, definitely. And but again, it almost kind of falls into place if you look at the congregation of sightings in East Texas and nearby Oklahoma and Louisiana and all that, where you see those heavily forested areas right around there. They just are very well concentrated, and it if there ever was a place that could support a large creature like this, a place where some undocumented primate could potentially hide and evade capture or discovery, yet be seen on occasion, this all adds up to be the perfect place right there at the tip of southwest Arkansas. So, it all kind of made sense.
The part that I find impressive is that we're talking about 75 or 100 individual encounters as opposed to like a UFO sighting where there might be 50 people seeing the same event all at one time. So we're really talking about one sighting. This is this guy, and then maybe a little later somebody else, or, I find that compelling. It's good. It's all good.
Right. And there's certainly something to the gravity of 50 people seeing a UFO. That's great evidence right there, because you have so many people sighting it at once. Unfortunately, most of the Faulk Monster sightings are done by individuals or maybe two people, but there are cases where more than 5 people at once had a sighting. So that's very significant, as far as a Bigfoot sighting goes. So, some really compelling evidence for this creature as far as, eyewitness reports go.
And one of the things, I don't know, when I think of Arkansas, I think of like moonshine, even though I might, maybe that's really more Alabama, but what about the credibility of the eyewitnesses? Now, I would think that because they are more rural, they're used to going out and, or at least at some point in time, going out and hunting and doing that kind of thing. Would that make them be a more reliable witness?
To me, it kind of does make them more credible, because, this isn't just some city boy going in the woods and he sees a glimpse of a bear and suddenly thinks it's a giant ape. A lot of the people, and especially the people that have reported the Faulk Monster, have been hunters and people that lived in the area. These people is going to be very familiar with the wildlife. They know the difference between a black panther and a bear, and an upright, hairy monster, essentially. And so, as I looked into the history reports and even interviewed people, there was many people that I found to be the best kind of witnesses. The people that are at home in the woods, people that live there. And so, while I did come across some reports or people telling me of some really wild things and things that I just didn't think sounded credible, I didn't include those in the book. So what's in the book was what I believed were solid sightings by, the most credible people possible. So that, again, kind of all supports the spooky theory that this thing does live.
In that spooky area. Ooh, I'm sorry. On the show, whenever I talk about Jefferson, I always have to have it be spooky with the spooky sound effect. Anyway, with the rise of cryptozoology and Bigfoot hunting, has anyone made a concerted effort to really spend time in those woods and look for this creature?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I know a lot of Bigfoot researchers in the area down here, and many of them have gone up there numerous times into the area and spent the night out there looking for evidence, performing whatever scientific research they could, whether blasting alleged Bigfoot calls into the night to see if you get a response, putting up game cameras, things like that. So, there is an ongoing effort by, just individuals, independent Bigfoot researchers, basically, to find evidence. And again, I mean, it's sort of like for the southern Bigfoot, the Fouke Monster is sort of the holy grail. I mean, if you could find some conclusive evidence in that case, I mean, that would be amazing, because it's just so well known, and even myself, I've been up there on canoeing trips down the Sulphur River. I've been out camping in various sites and walking through those woods, and have tried to see what I can see myself. And in the process of writing the book, of course, I definitely wanted to be familiar with that terrain and the land in order to be an authority on the subject. So, even myself and some of my associates have been out there searching as best we can for this creature.
It just seems like the area, and maybe I'm incorrect in this assumption, it could be, that the geographical area isn't that big. When you compare it to the Pacific Northwest, I mean, pretty much the entire state of Washington is one giant forest, where in that area, there's kind of like a strip that goes through, I don't know.
Yeah.
Just doesn't seem that big.
Yeah, I mean, well, I know what you're saying. It is quite broken up by little towns and, the invasions of civilization. But I think the point is not so much how big the space is, but is the space likely to be able to hide a creature like this? And if you kind of look at, I mentioned the Sulphur River. The Sulphur River runs a little bit southwest of Faulk, and associated with that area is the Sulphur River Wildlife Management area, which is about 20,000 square miles of just rough, uninhabitable, soggy, swampy bottomlands. And that's 20,000 acres just right there, and you really can't penetrate that very well. I mean, a lot of places are very boggy, and you need boats and things, and there's just not a lot of people going to and from out there except for maybe a few hunters. Would not be a problem for an animal who was adept at evasion and hiding and was reclusive to be able to survive out there, a small population of these. And, just again, that whole area in Texas is heavily forested all down towards the south, all along the Red River watershed. And in fact, people don't realize is Texas is only second to Alaska in the square miles of forest land. So while it's not Texas is big, but most of our forest land is concentrated into the east. While it's not the biggest space in the world, it is just cram-packed with woods and, a lot of trees and a lot of places to hide. So I think I kind of look at it from that perspective. Could an animal hide there? And I think it does fit the bill on that.
Cool. One of the things that you talk about, and I want to bring up because I found it intriguing, was the story about the monster in the case. And I'm just going to hand it over to you if you could just share that story with the listeners.
Well, yeah, I'll try to do this without doing any spoilers here, because this is one of the most kind of fascinating side roads of this case. But essentially what happened was, back in 1992, a couple of hunters found this huge skeleton, almost a carcass. I mean, it wasn't just bones laying there. It was still intact. It was just missing the skin and the head, essentially. And these hunters reported that to the sheriff down there. The sheriff of Harrison County went down, and he was from Marshall, where we just were, and this all took place right in there near Jefferson. And man, they didn't know what to make of this skeleton. So he had a vet come out and check it out, and they were going to haul it off like the next day. But in the meantime, the nephew of these hunters thought, wow, this is something, and maybe it's the same creatures they've been describing up in Boggy Creek. So he called a guy by the name of Smokey Crabtree, which plays heavily into the story of Boggy Creek. He was actually featured in the movie The Legend of Boggy Creek and so forth. But but basically what happened is Smokey got his hands on this skeleton and took it up to Fouke, Arkansas. And he set about trying to determine what exactly it was. And it is a creepy thing. I was fortunate to be able to see it several years ago. And so by now the thing is 20 years old. And it is the stinkiest, smelliest thing I have ever smelled in my life. You just could not believe the smell. But that's all tolerable when you're sitting there looking at this thing, because it is absolutely insane. You're just kind of thinking, what is it? It's huge. I mean, the skeleton is huge, and you're trying to picture it. If it was standing upright, if it was walking, what would it look like? How big would it be? And, the thoughts I'm having as I'm looking at it are the same thoughts that everybody else was having. Could this be evidence of a Sasquatch? And so there was a small documentary made about it. Smokey was showing it at kind of a music jamboree up in Fouke. People could see it, sort of like a sideshow type thing. I mean, it was a real, just the whole aura of this thing was just sideshow. But, this wasn't something made up. This was a real carcass. And so I began to look into the history of this to sort it out, because anybody who is into Bigfoot research and knows anything about the Fouke Monster has usually heard about the skeleton. And so I definitely wanted to flesh out as much of that and to find out what it was, if I could. And I interviewed the sheriff down there in Marshall that found it, which incidentally somebody at that conference last week told me he just passed away, so I was lucky to get an interview with the guy. But he recalled all the facts he knew about it and so forth, and I found some old news reports done out of Shreveport, Louisiana, that played into the case. And but yeah, I won't mention my assumptions of it or conclusions about it, because that's part of what is cool about that chapter of the book. But yeah, just a really fascinating thing, and I got to say, one of the coolest things I've ever seen, ever, in this type of research.
Okay, so everybody gets a secret, and you have to buy the book to find out. And you get a secret decoder ring. Okay, I'm lying about that part. But it would be good. Do they get a crypto card if they order the book?
Well, I do have my own trading card now. Yeah, I need to add that as like a bonus option or something. Of course, if you order the book from my website, it is signed, so that's a selling point about ordering it from me. But of course, it's on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, Kindle, Nook, the whole thing. So whatever people's poison is, they can order it. But it does sound like I'm kind of leading people on, saying, now buy the book for the whole story. But it's definitely one of those things where there's a huge spoiler. So the way I wrote the book is kind of follows my journey of investigation and research into this case, along with the history. But it's cool to kind of go along with me as I sort of go into it wide-eyed and seeing things like the skeleton, and trying to put together the pieces of it all.
Well, we have about 10 minutes, and there's one last piece that I want to cover. I mean, obviously, this monster in the case is potentially a huge piece of evidence. But it seems like, and I'm kind of shifting this to the Bigfoot phenomena in general, but you can also talk about, the Faulk Monster, Faulk, that guy. Anyway, but it is about the evidence. Have they found things like, fur samples that they can do DNA testing on, or footprints, or, any of that kind of Bigfoot-like evidence out there?
Well, I mean, Bigfoot researchers are always coming up with tangible evidence like that. I know several cases where they have some pretty good samples of hair that they're trying to have analyzed. The problem with the hair is you don't really have a known sample to compare it to. All you can end up coming up with is, well, it's not an ape, it's not a human, it's not a cougar. You can absolutely say what it's not, but you can never really say what it precisely is. So there are many cases of researchers finding the hair. There's, of course, the tracks and the footprints, another sort of secondhand level of evidence that, could possibly be the footprint of a real creature or not. There's no way to really prove it, but certainly the evidence, if you gather it up in the Bigfoot community at large, there is certainly a huge number of these footprints, and a lot of them found out in very remote areas where you wouldn't think people would be running up there to do a hoax. In fact, I found a guy who had made a very good track casting of an alleged Faulk Monster up there, and he had a cast that he showed me, and the place he found it was a place that was pretty much kind of only accessible by a canoe. And so these are the things that people find and, consider Sasquatch evidence. Of course, you got the blurry photos and all that as well, which doesn't prove one way or another. And in fact, I think if people got a really clear shot of a Bigfoot, even that would do as proof, because, you got Photoshop, you got so many ways to hoax these things now. People just wouldn't believe it. So unfortunately, the ultimate piece of evidence would be some sort of a body or a living creature or something like that. So until that turns up, all this other evidence is just hearsay.
If they've recovered fur from different locations and the results are it's not a bear, it's not a lion, it's not human, but have they compared the hair? So let's say they find some hair in Arkansas and they have some hair from the Pacific Northwest. Have they ever compared those hair samples together to see if they are related species?
That's a very good point. I can't think of a case offhand where they've tried to do that. I'm sure, researchers out there have done that. I don't know how wide the span is. Do we have a piece of hair from California and do we have one from Arkansas? Are we comparing the two? A lot of times, unfortunately, people don't play well together and share information, or they just are not in connection with each other to be able to do that. I mean, this is all done by primarily amateurs and, non-science type people doing the best they can. So, that's a good point. That would be a great study to try to collect a range of hairs from all over and start looking at those in relation to one another and see if they match. Because if they did, that would be some good supporting evidence to say that, this is perhaps a real creature.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it seems like if I get a DNA test, I could share my results of my DNA test with you, and those could be compared, or, microscopic slides of the hair follicle, whatever. That's science stuff. One of the things I was thinking while you were talking, and you probably don't know the answer, but I'm just going to throw it out there. But do you think that these creatures are intelligent? And when I say intelligent, more intelligent than our dogs and perhaps as intelligent as we are as humans?
Well, yeah. I mean, of course, there's no way to know that, but I kind of just, and I kind of base my, feelings or beliefs or whatever you want to call it on just some basic points of logic. And I would think that if the animal is real, and for it to have been so elusive and avoid capture all this time, I would have to venture to guess that it would have to be above average intelligence for an animal. It would have to have the edge, because a lot of people give it a lot more credit than that and say it's very human-like and this or that. And, of course, who's to say they may have had some sightings which, give them a better perspective. But I think it's, based on logic, we can just say that, yeah, they would have to be somewhat intelligent. I'm not sure what level, but definitely, smarter than your average armadillo, let's say, that frequently finds itself turned over in the road to be examined by whomever drives by. So that's not the case with Bigfoot. So, I'd have to say we got to give him some credit there.
Well, come on. This is Texas, smarter than a June bug. Those have got to be the dumbest creatures on the planet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because what I was thinking was, there's always the commentary, well, we don't ever find their remains anywhere. But if they were intelligent creatures, there is the possibility that they are burying, their deceased relatives. I mean, I'm just throwing that as a possibility,
Oh, sure. I mean, that's a popular theory, definitely, and the longer this goes, the search for something that you cannot find, you have to keep putting, people are compelled to put out these theories to explain it, and, that's definitely one of the top things that explains why we don't find a body. I mean, it's hard to find a dead animal in the woods as it is. I mean, I've been hunting quite a bit in my life, and I don't come across dead bears laying around. But certainly, people have discovered dead bears, and you would think that would be the same for Bigfoot, but thus far, apparently not.
Do you think that at some point in time we will find a Bigfoot, capture a Bigfoot, get enough evidence to, say conclusively that they exist or don't exist?
I think so. I mean, if they're real, certainly it's just a matter of time. And based on some knowledge that I have about things that are going on in the world of Bigfoot research, man, I wouldn't be surprised if I got a call later today from somebody telling me that they had some conclusive proof. So I'm almost just waiting for that to happen. But, who's to say, how long it'll take, though?
Mm-hmm. Well, we're almost out of time. If somebody wanted to get your book, The Beast of Boggy Creek, the true story of the Faulk Monster, where can they go get it?
Well, an easy way is to go to my website, lyallblackburn.com, and there's some links there to my book and my other projects and what have you. So there's also a site I created for information about the Faulk Monster, and that's Fouke, Fouke, monster.net. So you could go there, and there's a link on there for the book where you can buy it online directly from me, or hit the links up to Amazon or whatever format you're wanting it in. So those are the ways to get it. And I encourage people, if you're interested in the mysterious, the unknown, fascinating stories, and of course cryptozoology, monsters, even horror movie history, I think you might find the book fascinating.
Well, I think so too. I mean, one of the things that I was really impressed with was how well it was researched, you know, and you providing the kind of the case studies of the different sightings in the book, as opposed to just kind of making up some, you know, generalization summary of what they were saying. I mean, you did to a certain extent, but it seemed like you were giving a more blow-by-blow description as opposed to taking 4 or 5 cases and making a summary out of those.
Yeah, definitely. I tried to be very thorough, accurate, and to make it a compelling story, but also to make it journalistically sound. You know, I mean, I reference quotes and interview people whenever possible and include that as part of the summary of the sightings and kind of weave all that together in kind of a unified tale of the history of the Fouke Monster.
Well, I mean, well, that was a little startling. There's the music. But, Lyle, there's the music, which means we have to go. So thanks for coming on the show.
You bet.
And I'm sure I will see you again soon. And good luck with your book. And I hope you find Bigfoot soon, or the Faulk Monster, or that guy. Anyway, I'll talk to you later.
Definitely enjoyed it. Thanks.
All right. That's Lyle Blackburn. His book is The Beast of Boggy Creek. His webpage is www.lyleblackburn.com. And next week, come tune into the show, and it'll be me and Wayne LaLiberty talking about the conspiracy to uncover our past. Is our true history being hidden in plain sight? And call into the show. Get a reading, join the conversation. We are having open phone lines all day long. So we look forward to hearing from you then. And so until next week, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. Between now and then, have a happy Thanksgiving.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your browser to www.justenergyradio.com for more show information and to contact Dr. Rita. Until next time, remember,